There is a good reason why I'm showing you my secondary improvised test bench. I put this system on there for testing about 2 weeks ago and it lived as my secondary machine ever since. Literally I had to pull up myself by the shoestrings in order to build it into a proper machine. But this also means that I first have to take everything apart so it's ready for its intended case. A little while back I managed to get my hands on a GTX 1080 and ever since I've been agonizing whether to pair it up with a Ryzen 5 or an Intel i5. In the end, I narrowed it down to a 2600 and an 8400, and after lots of tossing and turning, I decided to go with the Intel system. CPUs have 6 cores, but the Ryzen also has SMT giving it 12 threads, so in pure CPU tasks it does have the edge, but in games it ever so slightly loses out because of its lower clock speed. In my opinion, the 2600 is the better CPU as it is unlocked and with a bit of tweaking it will outperform the i5 handily, the only problem being that most gamers don't care a fig about overclocking and just want a great out-of-the-box experience. Hopefully that is exactly what the system will provide and in spades. The motherboard I will be using is a B365M from Gigabyte, so there will be no memory OC, meaning that the 3000 Mbps alloy DRAM kit I will be pairing it with will not be able to reach its full potential. But it was an intentional choice in my part because it has 2666 Mbps JDate rating, which is the fastest this platform can handle. And with a bit of effort on my part, I created a stable profile with lower latency, so it now compares very well with the same CPU running on a more expensive Z390 board that does enable faster RAM. Nowadays most people know that they have to enable XMP profiles, so well, this is kind of the same thing I guess. So let's get to the actual building, and the first thing I'll do is replace the test 256GB SSD with a brand new crucial 500GB one, you know, for all those big texture packs you're gonna be using. Next I will be ditching the tower cooler for a Corsair H60 120mm AIO. This is simply egregious overkill, but somehow it feels right to have this system water cooled. The reasoning behind this is to have a system you can actually sleep next to without being bothered every time a background task spools up. I have already serviced the unit and changed the fluid, and now the pump is incredibly quiet, which fills me with confidence that this will do a good job for many years to come. Next, let's meet the case, a RGB-ified GameX White Diamond. It's a nice case in my opinion, inexpensive but definitely not cheap. I am going a bit overkill on the fans, 240mm at the front that will be set to the lower speed, 2 120mm ARGB fans on top, one with hub lighting and the other just with the ring light, and a hub plus ring light ARGB fan for the AIO. I am not using the included fan because it's a different model and doesn't really gel with the rest of the system. After everything that we pre-assembled on the bench is in, the case gets flipped and the PSU needs to be installed. I selected this HX750, which is way over spec for this system, and it also has a 0 RPM fan mode at idle, making it a good accompaniment. There is only one slight niggle with it because one of the coils is a bit whiny. I added silicone on top, and while it has help, it's still audible under heavy graphical load. This is how quiet the system is. Personally, it really does not bother me, but if anyone has a coil whiner version, I can always swap it out I guess. I needed to put the PSU in first to route the CPU power before adding the fans, as that would have made it really difficult to assemble otherwise. Second to last item to go in is this 1TB WD green hard drive. As usual, it's a freebie. It goes into the cage and back into the case. And with that said, if I have one criticism of this case is that it only has one hard drive space, but I don't think it will impact very many people. Now for the main event, the GPU. With the market being in such a sorry state as it is, I feel very lucky to have gotten this one, especially since it's an EVGA superclocked instead of the run-of-the-mill blower fan variants. I've been well impressed on how it performed relative to everything that came before it, and literally every AMD card of the same age. The leap in performance is dizzying and not something I think we will see again soon from one generation to the next. I never actually had the 10 series when it launched, instead opting to wait until I eventually got the 2080 Ti, but considering its direct predecessor, the 980, that I was rocking at the time had only 4 gigs of RAM, this would have been such a massive improvement. Even compares favorably to its successor, the 2080, that still only has 8 gigs of RAM, and if you ignore the RT features, then they are difficult to tell apart. And that's it as far as the build is concerned. It certainly looks good, but let's see how it actually performs. Is it all show and no go, or can you get a decent gaming experience out of it? Heaven, being the older benchmark that it is, went a bit on a power bender, posting a borderline ridiculous 179 FPS at ultra quality and normal tessellation. It is to be expected that the result would be okay considering the age gap, but the uplift in performance that the Pascal architecture provided compared to everything that came before it is just insane. A side note here, all tests are done at 1080p, and while this card would be more than okay for 1440p gaming and even 4K in some lighter titles, I'm not yet ready with the new benchmarking setup that will take into account resolutions higher than Full HD. Superposition is a much newer benchmark than Heaven, but it's made by the same people, and this time the GPU at 1080p high had no problems breezing through it with 84 FPS on average. This is where most GPUs usually start to flounder in my testing because of the varied workloads this benchmark hits them with. The 1080 had no issues driving home the point that it is still a modern GPU. Not sure what I was expecting with Rocket League. I knew it was going to run with silly high FPS, but decided to benchmark it anyway. Considering I got about 300 FPS on average, I think 99.9% of Rocket League gamers will find this perfectly acceptable. But then again, I'm sure there is someone out there that will point out there is such a thing as a 360Hz monitor, and you will have to excuse me while I go somewhere and not care about gimmicks. If you are a casual Fortnite gamer, just go for Epic and don't worry about it. The experience is great, the frame times are as good as you can reasonably expect from Fortnite's less than stellar engine, and you are guaranteed to have a great time. If you do have a high refresh rate monitor, then dropping the settings to medium while keeping Epic draw distance on and not touching the resolution scale slider will push the average frame rate over 200 and go a long way towards smoothing out any occasional frame time spikes. Zero Dawn is a gorgeous game, and with its hotly anticipated successor right around the corner, I've noticed a lot of people are replaying the original to remind themselves of the story. Even in 2021, it's still a difficult game to run on ultimate settings, but this PC doesn't really have an issue pushing past 75 FPS on average in the benchmark. In game, you will mostly see much higher frame rate, so 120Hz G-Sync or FreeSync monitor won't go to waste here. Or if you are a tad more limited, just enable VSync for a locked 60 or 75Hz experience depending on your monitor's refresh rate. Assassin's Creed Valhalla should be the poster child for using this GPU. It returns exactly 60 FPS in the benchmark and on its most arduous settings. In-game, you'll get higher than that most of the time, but I wholeheartedly recommend enabling G-Sync, FreeSync or even V-Sync and enjoying the game it was meant to be enjoyed, soaking up all the gorgeous vistas in this beautifully crafted game world. Stranding, with everything set as high as it will go, mostly stays into the triple-digit average FPS territory, with only occasional dips into the high 90s. I haven't experienced any serious frame time spikes or other stutters in my 10-minute playthrough. I'll be honest, for a game that centers on exploration with occasional firefights that you'll probably do your best to avoid, 60 FPS locked is very much acceptable. Anything over being a nice bonus. Cyberpunk 2077 is a really difficult game to run smoothly, but I'm sure this is no longer news to anyone. I would objectively recommend a medium preset that strikes a very good balance between visuals and fluidity, posting at 56 FPS during a drive in the downtown area with rain, and about 65 overall when indoor scenes are taken into consideration. Going to high and you will be limited to around 45 FPS in the most demanding areas, akin to a console experience. The low preset will consistently stay above 60 FPS. In the end, it's up to you how you would like to experience the game, but it's good to know you have a good range of options. Also, if anyone says CPUs don't matter for gaming or 4 cores are enough, let them play Cyberpunk on a quad core. Days Gone is one of my favorite recent games. The story isn't amazing by any means and the zombies are generic, but for someone who does not like zombie or pirate games, actually playing this and having such a good time that I finished it is a very rare treat indeed. I've tested the game here on very high, but those are pure overkill settings as the visual difference between high and very high is extremely limited to the point where most casual observers won't notice a thing. On the tested settings, the average was 78 FPS with occasional dips into the high 50s when entering on your motorcycle and climbing into the mid 90s when out in the wilderness. Swing to high will smooth out the frame times a tad and increase the average to 86, but unless you are super FPS sensitive, you're probably not gonna notice. And that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next one.